Irashaimase. Hello and welcome to Vitaris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Vitaris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have Plus Alpha, a 1989 arcade classic. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Jalico, Plus Alpha released to arcades in 1989. Now something that's interesting about this title, unlike most other arcade shoot-'em-ups of the era, there doesn't appear to be a lot of information about this one on the internet. So that could be a couple reasons for that. It is a somewhat generic vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up, but I still think there's a lot of interesting ideas present here, so I'm surprised there's not more coverage of it. It's also possible that there might not have been a very wide distribution of the game, and thus it remained rather unknown. Either way, it's available as an arcade archive title now for the Nintendo Switch and coming soon for the PlayStation 4. What kind of gameplay do we have here? Well, putting credits into the machine, first off, we see that it supports up to 2 players, but keep in mind it's not 2 players simultaneous, it's 2 players alternating. Once we begin, we get a brief character image of the pilot that we are, and that will be different depending on if you're player 1 or player 2. Player 1, you play as Celia, who flies the red ship, and player 2, you fly as Rumi, who pilots a bluish purple ship. So the ship we fly has a few interesting abilities. It's possible to transform between 3 different forms. Popeta, which is the transformation icon P, Jetta, the transformation icon J, and the H gives us Hedipo. So they're, of course, a turboprop, a jet, and a helicopter, respectively. And those forms have different shot types. We have 2 different shots for each ship. There's the normal shot, which is what you'll be using primarily, and there's also a hyper shot, which for all intents and purposes acts as a bomb. The hyper shot for Popeta here happens to be a really powerful explosion which will clear the enemies in the area, or at least do heavy damage to them, and also will eliminate all enemy shots in its radius, which can be very helpful. One thing to keep in mind though, these hyper shots do not give you invulnerability. For Hiripo here, we have a wave barrier which sweeps across the screen, dealing damage to enemies as well as clearing all the bullets ahead of us. And for Jetta, we have this laser wave which sweeps directly in front of the enemies, dealing a fair bit of damage. But overall, Jetta is definitely the weakest form. The jet is got this really weird zigzag pattern, and it's hard to hit enemies with it, at least somewhat consistently. Now, once you've completed a stage, if you happen to have any hyper shots left, you'll have this present game, which if you can match an image, you'll get a bonus. Those bonuses include 1-ups or shot power-ups or additional hyper shots. So the shot power-ups are super useful as they do increase the power of our shot itself. However, the power-ups are relatively rare to come by. There'll be these set of turnips that we can defeat, and those turnips will drop a power-up. Either it will be the super shot, which gives us a power-up. This is a super shot right here, and it'll increase our normal shot power from level 1 all the way up to level 7. But when we die, we're reset all the way back to level 1. So it's actually quite difficult to build up to a higher level of shot power. Also, when the turnip enemies that we can shoot for those power-ups appear, it's random whether they drop a power-up for your shot or if they drop a transformation item. That's something that's important to keep in mind, as there are some instances where at least I've experimented with something later in the game. The checkpoints in this game, and yes, it does use a checkpoint system, are laid out in a interesting fashion that I've never experienced before. If you happen to die right after starting from a checkpoint, you won't have passed the threshold that actually keeps you at your current checkpoint. You basically get set back to the previous checkpoint, which normally would be frustrating, but in certain situations, I find it useful to go back to get a greater chance of items, so you can potentially stand a better chance of survival. So that was the boss of our second stage. There are a total of 7 stages in the game. So basically the story is that Celia and Rumi are warriors that, well, you can kind of see it in the cutscene at the very beginning of the game, where you're launching out of this cannon to defeat, basically you're trying to rescue these 7 kingdoms from tyranny. A really basic story. But at least it gives you an idea of how many stages you have, and that is indeed the number of stories. So here we find ourselves in the 3rd stage, Flower Town. Both this stage and specifically the music to this stage actually felt nostalgic, even though I hadn't played this game before. And it took me a while to realize it, but the colorful background and the music just gives me this feel of a Puzzle Bobble or Bust-A-Move, depending on like which systems it released for. Really great puzzle game, available for, I believe it released on the Neo Geo originally. So here we have a transformation item. The Helipo is actually the transformation I like the best, so I don't want to change off of that, so I'm just going to ignore that for now. Okay, never mind. We'll go with Jita, the worst one. That's fine. So, basically, that is what we have for Plus Alpha. So, I mentioned there was some interesting cameos. Well, not really cameos. Celia is a playable character in the 1995 Jalico title, Game Tengoku, the Game Paradise, which would later be released years later on Steam, the Nintendo Switch, and the PlayStation 4. So, in that, she also pilots, instead of having the ability to change ship forms, we just pilot the Popera. And she's definitely one of the easier pilots to use, as the Popera shot specializes in spread, and so you've got a lot of great enemy coverage there. But that's not necessarily this game. As far as the minus flavors are concerned for Plus Alpha, well, the big one I have, after the first few stages, power-ups are very rare to come by, so especially getting up to a decent power is difficult. Hence the reason I was experimenting with using that weird checkpoint logic to go backwards in stages. There is also the fact that it does use a checkpoint system, which is not my favorite, but the checkpoints aren't that bad in this game, as they are actually pretty generously spaced, although there is some inconsistencies there. Specifically with the checkpoints for the bosses. Some bosses you'll have a checkpoint right before the boss, others you'll have to travel through some of the stage before you get to the boss. There's not really any consistency as far as what that will be. There is also some slowdown when you get a lot of enemies and shots on the screen. Not necessarily uncommon for the era. And another minus flavor is that it's 2-player alternating, not 2-player simultaneous. Though given the difficulty with the game handling the 1-player smoothly, I guess that's not like terribly surprising that we would have an alternating system rather than a simultaneous system. On the plus flavors, though, I really love the colorful backgrounds and just the different theming you have in all the stages. Each stage happens to have its own unique enemies in addition to your standard enemies, as well as a rather unique boss, though the bosses sometimes will fit the theme of the stage, sometimes not. Then the game itself just happens to have a really classic feel. From the art, which just screams late 80s anime, to just the general classic arcade feel of it, it definitely is a product of its era, and if it's one of those things that you like, this will definitely be enjoyable to you. So overall, if you're not a fan of late 80s shoot 'em ups, then Plus Alpha is one you could probably skip, but I've found a fair bit of enjoyment with the time I've spent with the title so far. Alright, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.